Captain Marcus Blackwood stood at attention in the marble courtyard of the royal palace, his polished armor gleaming under the morning sun. 20 years of loyal service had earned him the highest honor a soldier could achieve, becoming a royal sentinel, protector of the crown and guardian of the realm's most precious secrets. His weathered face showed no emotion as he received his daily briefing from Commander Hayes, but inside, something felt different about this particular morning. The palace buzzed with unusual activity. Servants scurried through corridors with worried expressions, and Marcus noticed how the other guards exchanged nervous glances when they thought no one was watching. The Kingdom of Valdris had been experiencing growing unrest in recent months. Reports of rebellion in the outer provinces, food shortages, and whispered complaints about King Aldrich's harsh taxation policies had reached even the palace walls. Commander Hayes handed Marcus a sealed scroll bearing the royal seal. "Your orders for today, Captain." The king has specific instructions regarding the Market District Patrol. There have been reports of suspicious gatherings near the old fountain. Marcus accepted the scroll without question, as he had done countless times before. His duty was simple and clear: follow orders, protect the crown, maintain order. He had never questioned a command in his entire military career. The concept of disobedience was as foreign to him as mercy was to a wolf. As he prepared to leave for his patrol, Marcus noticed a small figure huddled near the palace gates. A child no more than 8 years old sat alone on the stone steps leading to the main entrance. The boy's clothes were torn and dirty, his dark hair matted with dust. Most striking were his eyes, large, brown, and filled with a mixture of fear and determination that seemed far too mature for his young face. The child made no sound, spoke no words, yet something about his presence caught Marcus's attention in a way that defied explanation. Guards typically ignored the beggars and street children who sometimes lingered near the palace, but this boy was different. He sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed directly on Marcus with an intensity that made the seasoned soldier uncomfortable. Marcus approached the child cautiously. "What are you doing here, boy? This is no place for you." The child's lips remained sealed, but his eyes never left Marcus's face. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the boy raised his small hand and pointed toward the scroll Marcus held. Then, with deliberate movements, he traced something in the dirt at his feet. Marcus looked down and saw a crude drawing, a circle with lines radiating outward like the sun, and beneath it, what looked like a cluster of small figures. "What is this supposed to mean?" Marcus asked, but the child only continued staring at him with those haunting eyes. A fellow guard approached. "Captain, we should move along. Commander Hayes is expecting your report by noon." Marcus nodded but found himself glancing back at the silent child as he walked away. The boy remained motionless, watching until Marcus disappeared around the corner. Something about that encounter left an unsettling feeling in the captain's chest, though he couldn't understand why. The market district was unusually quiet when Marcus arrived with his patrol unit. The cobblestone streets, normally bustling with merchants and customers, held only scattered vendors and a few cautious shoppers. The famous fountain at the district's center, once a gathering place for celebrations and community events, stood surrounded by an eerie stillness. Marcus opened his orders and read them carefully. The king commanded him to disperse any gathering of more than 5 people near the fountain. Anyone who refused to leave peacefully was to be arrested immediately. Furthermore, if any individual was found distributing pamphlets or speaking against the crown, they were to be detained for questioning at the palace dungeons. As the morning progressed, Marcus and his men patrolled the area methodically. They encountered a few small groups of people, mostly families shopping for food or elderly citizens resting on benches. Each group dispersed quickly when the guards approached. No questions asked, no resistance offered. Near midday, Marcus noticed a commotion developing near a baker's stall. A crowd of about 15 people had gathered, and their voices carried an edge of frustration and anger. As he approached, Marcus could hear fragments of their conversation: complaints about bread prices, concerns about missing family members, and whispered fears about recent disappearances in the night. "This is exactly what our orders warned us about," Sergeant Mills whispered to Marcus. "Should we move in and break it up?" Marcus studied the crowd more carefully. These weren't dangerous revolutionaries or violent agitators. He saw working mothers holding babies, elderly craftsmen with calloused hands, and young fathers whose faces showed the strain of trying to feed their families. Their conversation, while critical of current policies, seemed more desperate than treasonous. "Captain," Mills pressed for instructions. Before Marcus could respond, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. At the edge of the crowd stood the same silent child from the palace gates. The boy's eyes met Marcus's across the square, and once again, he raised his hand to point, this time not at the scroll, but at the crowd of desperate citizens. The child then performed the same deliberate gesture he had made earlier, tracing the sun symbol in the air. But this time, Marcus understood. The radiating lines weren't just decoration. They represented people, individuals spreading outward from a central point. And the cluster of small figures beneath? They represented families, communities, the very people standing before him now. The child's message was becoming clear, though Marcus couldn't yet grasp its full meaning. Something terrible was about to happen, and this silent boy was trying to warn him. But warn him of what? And why had fate chosen a royal sentinel, a man sworn to absolute obedience, to receive this cryptic message? As Marcus stood frozen between his duty and his growing unease, the child slowly shook his head from side to side, a universal gesture of no that needed no words to be understood. The boy's eyes pleaded with Marcus, begging him to see what others could not, to understand what others would not. For the first time in 20 years of military service, Captain Marcus Blackwood found himself questioning an order before he had even attempted to carry it out. The weight of his armor suddenly felt unbearable as Marcus stood in the market square, caught between duty and an inexplicable sense of dread. The child had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared, leaving Marcus with more questions than answers. The crowd near the baker's stall continued their worried discussion, unaware that their fate hung in the balance of one man's internal struggle. Sergeant Mills shifted impatiently beside him. "Captain, the longer we wait, the larger this gathering becomes. Our orders were clear." Marcus looked at his men, 5 loyal soldiers who had followed him through countless missions without question. They trusted his judgment completely, never doubting that his commands came from wisdom earned through years of service. How could he explain that a silent child's cryptic gestures were making him question everything he had ever believed about duty and honor? "Form a perimeter, but keep your distance," Marcus finally ordered. "I want to observe before we act." Mills raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Yes, sir." As his men positioned themselves around the square, Marcus found himself studying the crowd with new eyes. What he had initially seen as a potential threat now looked different. A young mother bounced a crying baby while listening to an elderly man speak about his missing son. 2 merchants discussed how their businesses were failing due to new taxes. A teenage girl clutched her grandmother's hand as the old woman wept quietly. These were not enemies of the state. They were citizens of Valdres, his own people, struggling to survive under increasingly harsh conditions. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. In 20 years of service, when had he stopped seeing the people he was supposed to protect and started seeing only potential threats to be eliminated? A memory surfaced from his childhood. His father, a simple blacksmith, gathering with neighbors to discuss problems in their village. He remembered feeling proud that adults trusted each other enough to share their worries and work together for solutions. When had such gatherings become acts of treason? The crowd near the fountain began to disperse naturally as people finished their conversations and returned to their daily tasks. Marcus watched them leave, ordinary citizens going about ordinary lives, and felt something shift inside his chest. The child's message was becoming clearer. These people were not the enemy. But if they weren't the enemy, then who was? Later that afternoon, Marcus returned to the palace to file his report. Commander Hayes waited in his office along with Lord Chancellor Vex, the king's most trusted advisor. Vex was a thin, pale man with cold eyes, who seemed to take particular pleasure in the suffering of others. Marcus had never liked him, though he had always kept such personal feelings to himself. "Well, Captain?" Hayes asked. "Any trouble in the market district?" Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding. "No significant disturbances, sir. A few small groups gathered, but they dispersed peacefully when we arrived." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. He made no mention of the larger gathering or the conversations he had overheard. Something deep in his gut warned him that providing those details would lead to consequences he wasn't prepared to face. Lord Chancellor Vex leaned forward, his expression sharp. "Define small groups, Captain. Our informant suggests there was considerable activity near the fountain today. The word informant sent a chill through Marcus. The kingdom had always had spies, but lately, their presence seemed more pervasive, more sinister. Citizens were being encouraged to report on their neighbors, friends, even family members. The very fabric of trust that held communities together was being systematically destroyed. Nothing that posed a threat to public order. Marcus replied carefully. Mostly families and elderly citizens taking shelter from the sun. Vex's eyes narrowed. I see. And you feel confident in your assessment of what constitutes a threat? The question felt like a trap, but Marcus had spent decades navigating military politics. I follow my training and experience, my lord. 20 years of service has taught me to distinguish between genuine threats and ordinary citizen concerns. Hayes nodded approvingly, but Vex continued to study Marcus with suspicious interest. Ordinary citizen concerns can evolve into extraordinary citizen problems, Captain. It's often better to address potential issues before they become actual issues. Of course, my lord. I understand the importance of vigilance. After the meeting, Marcus walked through the palace corridors with his mind churning. The conversation with Vex had revealed more than intended. There was clearly pressure from above to take a harder line with the people, to treat every gathering as a potential rebellion. But what if the real rebellion was the systematic oppression of innocent citizens who simply wanted to voice legitimate concerns? As he passed through the main courtyard, Marcus noticed the silent child again. This time the boy stood near the royal gardens, partially hidden behind a marble statue. Their eyes met across the space, and the child held up his hand in a different gesture, not pointing but holding up 5 fingers. 5. What did 5 mean? Marcus tried to make sense of it, but before he could approach, a palace guard shooed the child away. Get out of here, beggar. This isn't a place for street rats. The child ran without making a sound, but not before giving Marcus one last meaningful look. As he disappeared through the palace gates, Marcus felt an overwhelming urge to follow, to find answers to questions he was only beginning to understand how to ask. That evening, Marcus sat in his quarters reviewing patrol schedules and duty rosters. His small room in the officers' quarters was spartanly furnished. A bed, a desk, a chest for his personal belongings. On the wall hung his ceremonial sword, a gift from the king himself upon his promotion to Royal Sentinel. For 20 years, that sword had represented everything he valued: honor, duty, service to the crown. Now, as he stared at it, Marcus wondered if those values meant the same thing they once had. Was honor truly about following orders without question, or was it about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves? Was duty to the crown the same as duty to the people the crown was supposed to serve? A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Sergeant Mills entered, his usual confident demeanor replaced by obvious concern. Captain, I need to speak with you privately, Mills said, glancing around nervously before closing the door. What is it, Sergeant? Mills moved closer and lowered his voice. It's about tomorrow's orders, sir. I overheard Commander Hayes talking with Lord Chancellor Vex. There's going to be a major operation in the market district. Marcus felt his stomach clench. What kind of operation? Mass arrests, sir. They're planning to round up anyone who's been identified as attending gatherings or expressing dissent. The list includes families, children, elderly citizens, anyone who's been reported by the informants. The number 5 suddenly made terrible sense. 5 days. The child had been warning him that he had 5 days before something awful happened. But how could a street child possibly know about classified military operations? How many people are we talking about, Mills? The sergeant's face was pale. Over 100, sir. They're converting the old granary into a temporary prison. Lord Chancellor Vex says it's necessary to prevent the unrest from spreading. Marcus stared at his ceremonial sword, feeling the weight of an impossible choice settling on his shoulders. For 20 years he had been the perfect soldier, obedient, loyal, unquestioning. But tomorrow, those very qualities would make him an instrument of oppression against innocent people who had done nothing more than express their fears and hopes to their neighbors. The silent child's message was complete now. He wasn't just warning Marcus about what was going to happen. He was asking Marcus to prevent it. Marcus spent the night staring at the ceiling of his quarters, unable to find even a moment's rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the people from the market square. The worried mother with her crying baby, the elderly man searching for his missing son, the young girl comforting her weeping grandmother. Soon all of them would be dragged from their homes and thrown into prison for the crime of being human. When dawn broke over the palace walls, Marcus had made his decision. For the first time in his military career, he would disobey a direct order. But disobedience alone wouldn't save those innocent people. He needed a plan. He dressed carefully in his full ceremonial armor, knowing it might be the last time he would have the right to wear it. The polished metal felt heavier than usual, weighted down by the magnitude of what he was about to do. As he strapped on his sword, Marcus realized he was crossing a line from which there would be no return. The first step was to find the child. Something told him the mysterious boy held more answers than a street orphan should possess. Marcus left the palace through the servants' entrance, avoiding the main courtyard where other guards might question his early departure. The city was just beginning to wake up as Marcus walked through the narrow streets surrounding the palace district. Bakers were lighting their ovens, shopkeepers were opening their doors, and early workers were making their way to the docks and warehouses. All of them completely unaware that before the sun set, their lives would change forever. Marcus found the child sitting on the steps of an abandoned church in the old quarter of the city. The boy showed no surprise at seeing the captain approach, almost as if he had been waiting for this encounter. Up close, Marcus could see that despite his ragged appearance, the child's eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost otherworldly. "You knew I would come," Marcus said, settling down on the steps beside the boy. The child nodded silently, then began tracing symbols in the dust between his feet. This time his drawings were more elaborate, a map of the market district complete with streets, buildings, and what looked like guard positions. Then he drew arrows showing movement patterns and escape routes. "You know about the arrest planned for today," Marcus said. It wasn't a question, another nod. The child held up his hand again, but this time he showed 4 fingers, then pointed to the rising sun. 4 hours until the operation began. "Can you speak?" Marcus asked gently. The child opened his mouth, and Marcus saw why he remained silent. His tongue had been cut out. The brutal mutilation spoke of deliberate cruelty, designed not just to silence but to terrorize. Someone had wanted to make sure this child could never tell what he had seen or heard. Rage filled Marcus's chest. What kind of monster would do such a thing to a child? And what had this boy witnessed that was so dangerous it required such extreme measures to ensure his silence? The child continued drawing in the dust, creating a more detailed picture of his knowledge. He drew the palace, the market district, and lines connecting them. Then he drew figures representing guards and crossed them out one by one, leaving only a single figure standing, Marcus himself. The message was clear. Marcus was the only one in a position to stop what was about to happen. But the child wasn't finished. He drew more symbols, a house with people inside, then guards surrounding it, then the people being led away in chains. He repeated this pattern multiple times, showing that the arrests wouldn't be limited to the market district. They would spread throughout the city like a plague. "How do you know all this?" Marcus whispered. The child pointed to his eyes, then to various buildings around them. He had been watching, listening, gathering information that no one thought a mute street orphan could understand or remember. He had been invisible in plain sight, the perfect spy. But why was he helping Marcus? The child seemed to understand the question without it being asked. He reached into his ragged shirt and pulled out a small piece of cloth, torn, faded, but still recognizable as part of a royal guard uniform. Not the current style, but the design used about 15 years ago. The child pointed to the cloth, then to himself, then to Marcus. Suddenly, Marcus understood. This boy was the child of a royal guard, probably one who had been killed or disappeared for asking the wrong questions or refusing the wrong orders. The child had been silenced to prevent him from revealing what his father had discovered or attempted to do. "Your father was a guard," Marcus said softly. "He tried to do the right thing, didn't he?" Tears filled the child's eyes as he nodded. Then he wiped them away and returned to his drawings with renewed determination. He sketched out a plan. Guards positioned at key intersections, signals for warning the targeted families, escape routes through the old sewer system that connected to the docks. Marcus studied the child's plan with growing amazement. It was sophisticated, well thought out, and showed intimate knowledge of both the city's layout and the palace's military procedures. This boy had been planning for this moment for a long time. "We can't save everyone," Marcus said, the reality of their situation weighing heavily on him. "There are too many targets, and I'm only one person." The child shook his head firmly and drew more symbols. He wasn't suggesting that Marcus work alone. Throughout the city, hidden among the ordinary citizens, were others who had been watching, waiting, hoping for someone with authority to take a stand. The child's father hadn't been the only guard who had harbored doubts about the direction of the kingdom. As if to prove his point, a shadow fell across them. Marcus looked up to see Sergeant Mills approaching, his face grim but determined. "I thought I might find you here, Captain," Mills said, glancing at the child with curiosity but no hostility. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night. And what conclusions have you reached?" Marcus asked carefully. Mills sat down on the church steps, his armor clanking softly. "I joined the Royal Guard to protect people, sir. Somewhere along the way, I seem to have lost sight of what that actually means." The child looked between the two guards, then resumed his drawing with added urgency. He sketched out guard positions for the planned arrests, showing Mills exactly where his fellow soldiers would be stationed and what their orders would be. Mills studied the drawings with growing horror. Dear God, they really are planning to arrest entire families. Children, elderly people, pregnant women, anyone who's been reported by the informants. "The question is," Marcus said, "are you prepared to do something about it?" Mills was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he looked up, his expression had hardened with resolve. "My sister lives in the market district, Captain. She has 3 young children and a husband who works at the docks. Last week she mentioned that food prices were becoming impossible to manage. If she said that to the wrong person, her name could be on today's arrest list." The child nodded vigorously and pointed to a house he had drawn near the fountain. Then he made a gesture indicating a woman with children. "He knows about your sister," Marcus realized. "He's been watching, learning, preparing to help people like her." Mills looked at the child with new respect. "Who are you, boy?" The child couldn't answer with words, but his drawings spoke volumes. He showed them more than just escape routes and guard positions. He revealed a network of people throughout the city who had been quietly organizing, waiting for the right moment to act. Merchants who could hide families in their storage rooms, dock workers who could smuggle people onto ships, even servants within the palace who had grown sick of watching innocent people disappear. The child's plan wasn't just about preventing arrests. It was about revolution. Not the violent, destructive kind that tore kingdoms apart, but the quiet, necessary kind that restored humanity to those who had forgotten what it meant to serve rather than dominate. Marcus felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders in a completely new way. He had spent 20 years following orders without question. Now, he was being asked to give orders that would define not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone who chose to follow him. The child finished his drawings and looked up at Marcus expectantly. In those eyes, the captain saw hope, determination, and an unshakable faith that good people could still choose to do good things, even when it cost them everything they had previously held dear. The moment of truth arrived sooner than expected. Marcus had barely returned to the palace when emergency bells began ringing throughout the compound. Commander Hayes appeared in the courtyard, shouting orders to assemble all available guards immediately. The mass arrest operation had been moved up by 2 hours. "Captain Blackwood," Hayes called out as Marcus approached. "There's been a change of plans. Lord Chancellor Vex received intelligence that some of our targets might be planning to flee. We move out immediately." Marcus felt his heart racing but kept his expression neutral. "Understood, sir. What are our specific orders?" Hayes handed him a detailed list of names and addresses. Over 150 people to be arrested throughout the city. Marcus quickly scanned the list and felt sick. Elena Marquez's name was there, along with Mills's sister and her family. Even more disturbing were names he recognized as palace servants, guards, and other officials who had apparently been deemed unreliable. "Sir," Marcus said carefully, "this list includes some of our own personnel. Traitors come in all forms." "Captain?" Lord Chancellor Vex's cold voice cut through the morning air as he approached them. "Loyalty to the crown must be absolute or it is worthless. Anyone who questions the king's authority, regardless of their position, has chosen to become an enemy of the state." Vex stepped closer to Marcus, his pale eyes studying the captain's face intently. "I trust you understand the gravity of today's mission, Captain." This operation will determine who truly serves Valdris and who merely pretends to do so. The words felt like a direct challenge, and Marcus realized that his own loyalty was being tested. Vex suspected something, though he couldn't know the extent of Marcus's involvement in the morning's warning activities. "I have served the crown faithfully for 20 years, Marcus replied. "Today will be no different." It wasn't exactly a lie, but Marcus knew his definition of serving the crown had fundamentally changed. True loyalty meant protecting the kingdom's people, not terrorizing them into submission. The operation began with military precision. 5 separate units were deployed throughout the city, each responsible for specific districts. Marcus found himself commanding the unit assigned to the market area, the very place where this crisis of conscience had begun. As they marched through the streets, Marcus caught glimpses of the child's network in action. A flower seller near the fountain gave subtle hand signals to customers, warning them to avoid certain streets. A group of dock workers moved with unusual purpose toward the harbor, ready to help families escape by boat if necessary. Even some of the palace servants they passed made eye contact with Marcus, their expressions conveying both fear and hope. When they reached Elena's bakery, Marcus's unit found it empty except for the widow herself, calmly cleaning her counters as if nothing unusual was happening. "Elena Marquez," Marcus announced formally. "You are under arrest by order of King Aldrich for seditious activity and conspiracy against the crown." Elena looked up at him with steady eyes. "I understand, Captain." But as Marcus approached to place her in custody, Elena whispered barely audibly, "The others?" "Safe," Marcus replied just as quietly, then louder for his men to hear. "Secure the premises and search for evidence of illegal gatherings." While his soldiers searched the bakery, Marcus helped Elena gather a few personal belongings. To any observer, he was simply being professionally courteous to a prisoner. In reality, he was giving her time to confirm that her hidden messages had reached their intended recipients. The pattern repeated throughout the morning. Marcus's unit arrived at house after house only to find them mysteriously empty. Families had vanished with remarkable efficiency, leaving behind only the faintest traces of hasty departure. Other guard units were reporting similar results, targets who had somehow learned of the operation and fled before arrests could be made. By midday, the operation was clearly failing. Of the 150 people on the arrest list, fewer than 20 had actually been captured. Lord Chancellor Vex's face grew darker with each negative report that reached palace headquarters. "This is impossible," Vex snarled at Commander Hayes. "Entire families don't just vanish into thin air. Someone warned them." Marcus stood at attention with the other unit commanders, listening to Vex's rage while maintaining a perfectly neutral expression. Inside, however, he felt a mixture of relief and growing dread. They had saved most of the innocent people on the list, but the cost of that success was becoming clear. Vex would not rest until he found someone to blame for the operation's failure. "Sir," offered Captain Reynolds from the Dock District unit, "it's possible the targets had their own intelligence network. Street people talk to each other. Word could have spread naturally." Vex's cold eyes fixed on Reynolds with deadly intensity. "Are you suggesting that common criminals are more organized and efficient than the Royal Guard?" Reynolds paled but stood his ground. "No, sir. I'm simply trying to understand how this happened." The child appeared again as Marcus's unit was returning to the palace for debriefing. The boy stood in the shadow of a market stall, watching as the frustrated guards marched past their failed objectives. When Marcus caught sight of him, the child held up both hands, fingers spread wide. 10. But then he closed his hands into fists and shook his head sadly. Marcus understood immediately. They had saved many people, but 10 families hadn't received warnings in time. 10 families were now in custody, facing interrogation and possible execution for the crime of expressing concern about their kingdom's direction. Among the captured was an elderly scholar named Professor Aldwin, whose only crime had been discussing historical examples of successful governance with his students. Also taken was Maria Santos, a seamstress whose husband had been conscripted into military service and never returned. Her arrest came because she had asked other military wives if they had received any news of their missing husbands. As Marcus watched these innocent people being led into the palace dungeons, he realized that saving some while losing others felt almost worse than if he had done nothing at all. Every face among the captured would haunt him, a reminder that his rebellion had been incomplete, imperfect, insufficient. That evening, as Marcus sat in his quarters writing his official report of the day's events, he heard footsteps in the corridor outside his door. Multiple sets of footsteps moving with military precision and stopping directly outside his room. A sharp knock echoed through the small chamber. "Captain Blackwood, you are summoned for immediate questioning by Lord Chancellor Vex." Marcus felt no surprise, only a strange sense of relief. The pretense was over. He had chosen his side, acted on his conscience, and saved dozens of innocent lives. Now he would face the consequences of those choices. He opened the door to find 4 palace guards waiting for him, their expressions professional, but not unkind. These men had served under his command at various times, and while they would follow orders, they took no personal pleasure in his downfall. "Captain," said Sergeant Torres, a man Marcus had recommended for promotion just months earlier. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have orders to escort you to the Lord Chancellor's office." Marcus nodded and straightened his uniform one final time. "I understand, Sergeant. Lead the way." As they walked through the palace corridors, Marcus caught sight of the child one last time. The boy stood at a window in the servants' quarters, watching the small procession pass below. Their eyes met across the distance, and the child raised his hand in a final gesture, not pointing this time but saluting. One small fist pressed against his heart in the traditional gesture of respect given to fallen warriors. Marcus returned the salute with a slight nod, knowing that while his military career was ending, the child's silent revolution would continue. The seeds of change had been planted, and they would grow in ways that Lord Chancellor Vex could never predict or control. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of careful planning and desperate preparation. Marcus and Mills, guided by the silent child's detailed knowledge, moved through the city like shadows, warning key families and coordinating with the hidden network of sympathizers the boy had revealed. Their first stop was a bakery owned by Elena Marquez, a widow whose husband had been a palace cook before his sudden disappearance 6 months earlier. The child led them through a maze of back alleys to her shop, where they found her preparing bread for the morning customers. When she saw Marcus in his captain's uniform, fear immediately filled her eyes. "Please," she whispered, backing away from the counter. "I haven't done anything wrong. My children and I, we keep to ourselves, we don't cause trouble." "We're not here to arrest you," Marcus said gently, removing his helmet so she could see his face clearly. "We're here to warn you. In less than 3 hours, guards will come for you and many others. We're trying to help people escape." Elena stared at him in disbelief.
"Why would a royal captain help people like me?"
Mills stepped forward. "Because some of us still remember what we swore an oath to protect." The child moved to Elena's counter and began drawing his now familiar symbols in the flour dust. He showed her the route to the old church where other families were gathering, then drew the dock area where friendly merchants were preparing to hide people until the danger passed. Elena studied the drawings, then looked back at Marcus. "How do I know this isn't a trap? How do I know you're not trying to trick me into running so you can arrest me for fleeing?" It was a fair question. Marcus had no proof of his intentions except his word. And why should a frightened mother trust the word of someone who represented the very system that was threatening her family? The child seemed to understand the dilemma. He pulled out the piece of his father's uniform again and showed it to Elena. Then he pointed to himself, to the cloth, and to Marcus. Somehow Elena understood the connection. "Your father was a guard too," she said to the child, "and he tried to help people like me." The boy nodded, then pointed to Marcus and made a gesture indicating continuation, carrying on his father's work. Elena was quiet for a moment, studying Marcus's face. Finally, she nodded. "What do you need me to do?" They established Elena's bakery as a message center. Her morning customers included many of the people on the arrest list, and she could warn them under the guise of normal business interactions. She would also prepare food packages for the families who would need to. Lord Chancellor Vex's office was a study in intimidation. Dark tapestries covered the walls, and the only light came from candles that cast flickering shadows across the room. Behind an imposing desk sat Vex himself, his pale features made even more sinister by the dancing flames. To his right stood Commander Hayes, looking deeply uncomfortable with the proceedings. "Captain Marcus Blackwood," Vex began without preamble. 20 years of exemplary service to the crown. An impressive record until today. Marcus stood at attention, saying nothing. There was no point in denying what they both knew was true. Vex rose from his chair and began pacing around Marcus like a predator circling wounded prey. Today's operation was a disaster. Of 150 targets, we captured barely 15%. Such failure requires explanation. Perhaps our intelligence was flawed, Marcus suggested, or perhaps the people of Valdris are more resourceful than we anticipated. Resourceful, Vex repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Yes, I suppose it would take considerable resources to warn over 100 families about secret arrest warrants. Resources like, perhaps, advanced knowledge from someone with access to classified information. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from the guttering candles. Commander Hayes shifted uncomfortably, clearly hoping this interrogation would end quickly and quietly. Vex stopped directly in front of Marcus, their faces only inches apart. We found something interesting in Elena Marquez's bakery, Captain. Flour on the counter arranged in patterns that looked suspiciously like street maps and military positions, almost as if someone had been using her establishment to coordinate activities. Marcus kept his expression neutral, though his mind raced. The child had drawn his plans in Elena's flour, but they should have cleaned up all evidence before the arrest team arrived. Street children often play in flour and dust, Marcus replied calmly. They draw pictures in games wherever they can find materials. Street children. Vex smiled coldly. How interesting that you should mention them. We've received reports of a mute child who's been seen around the palace for several weeks. A boy with unusual knowledge of guard routines and palace activities. Some witnesses placed him near your position on multiple occasions. The net was closing around both Marcus and the child. Vex might not have solid proof yet, but he had enough circumstantial evidence to justify extreme measures. In the current climate of fear and suspicion, circumstantial evidence was often more than enough. Children are naturally curious about soldiers in uniforms, Marcus said. It's not uncommon for them to watch guard activities. Vex returned to his desk and picked up a piece of parchment. This is a confession, Captain. It admits to passing classified information to enemies of the state, coordinating with insurgent networks, and undermining royal authority. Sign it and your punishment will be swift and merciful. Refuse and we will be forced to extract the truth through more intensive methods. Marcus looked at the confession, knowing that signing it would not only seal his own fate but also provide Vex with justification for expanded arrests and interrogations. The child's network of sympathizers would be hunted down and eliminated, and the innocent families they had saved would eventually be recaptured. I need time to read this thoroughly, Marcus said, stalling for time while his mind worked through rapidly dwindling options. You have until dawn, Vex replied. Guards will escort you to a holding cell where you can consider your decision in privacy. As Marcus was led from the office, he caught a glimpse of movement in the corridor shadows. For just a moment he saw the child crouched behind a marble pillar, listening to everything. The boy's eyes met Marcus's briefly, and the captain saw determination that burned brighter than fear. The holding cell was small but not uncomfortable, clearly designed for detaining officers rather than common criminals. Marcus sat on the narrow cot and tried to think of a way out of the situation that wouldn't result in disaster for everyone he had tried to help. Hours passed in the darkness. Marcus dozed fitfully, waking several times to the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside. Each time he expected guards to come for him, but they passed by without stopping. Near midnight, Marcus heard a different sound, a soft scraping noise coming from the small window high in his cell wall. He looked up to see metal bars being carefully moved aside, and then the child's face appeared in the opening. The boy gestured urgently for Marcus to move closer to the window. When the captain climbed onto his cot to reach the opening, the child handed him a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside, Marcus found a palace guard uniform in his size, along with forged documents bearing official seals. You want me to escape, Marcus whispered. The child nodded, then held up his hands to show a complex series of gestures. Marcus was beginning to understand the boy's sign language, developed through necessity and refined through years of silent communication. The child was telling him about ships in the harbor, friendly merchants who could provide passage to neighboring kingdoms, and safe houses where Marcus could hide until arrangements were made. But more importantly, the child was explaining that Marcus's capture had catalyzed something unexpected. Word of the failed arrests had spread throughout the city faster than palace officials could control. People who had never spoken against the crown before were beginning to ask questions about why their neighbors had been targeted. Palace servants were whispering about the captain who had risked everything to protect innocent families. The child's gestures became more animated as he explained that Marcus's act of defiance had not been in vain. It had inspired others to question the direction of the kingdom, to resist the growing tyranny that threatened to destroy everything they held dear. But the child also conveyed a warning. Vex was planning something far worse than mass arrests. Documents had been discovered in the Lord Chancellor's private chambers outlining plans for public executions, designed to terrorize the population into absolute submission. Marcus's confession would provide the legal justification for these extreme measures. "I can't just run away," Marcus protested quietly. "Those people captured today will die if I escape." The child shook his head firmly and continued his gestures. He was explaining that Marcus's escape was not about self-preservation, it was about revolution. Outside the palace walls, a growing network of resistance fighters was organizing. They needed leadership, military expertise, and most importantly, a symbol that even royal sentinels could choose conscience over blind obedience. Marcus stared at the forged documents in his hands, realizing that this decision would define not just his own future, but the future of everyone in Valdris who still believed in justice over tyranny. As dawn approached, Marcus heard footsteps in the corridor, real ones this time, heading directly for his cell. Vex was coming for his answer, and time had run out for indecision. Marcus looked up at the window where the child waited patiently, then down at the confession that lay on his cot where Vex had left it. In that moment, he understood that some choices transcend personal cost. Some decisions are so fundamental that they define not just what a person does, but who a person chooses to be. When the cell door opened and Lord Chancellor Vex entered with his guards, he found Captain Marcus Blackwood standing at attention in full uniform, the unsigned confession torn into pieces at his feet. "I see you've made your choice," Captain Vex said coldly. "Yes," Marcus replied, meeting the Lord Chancellor's gaze without flinching. "I choose to serve Valdris and her people, not the ambitions of tyrants who have forgotten what true leadership means." The child's silent revolution had found its voice, and that voice belonged to a royal sentinel who had finally learned the difference between following orders and doing what was right. As Marcus was led away to face whatever consequences awaited, he knew that the seeds of change had been planted too deeply to be destroyed by any force Vex could bring to bear. The kingdom of Valdris was about to discover that revolutions don't always announce themselves with violence and chaos. Sometimes they begin with a single act of conscience, inspired by the silent courage of a child who refused to let injustice go unanswered.